Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Now, I have a question for you. Would you support a war if you knew you were going to get all of the construction contracts to rebuild the cities after it was done? Well, at least one individual in America has said yes to that question, and today we're going to talk about who. My guest today, not that individual, is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Army, recognized for his leadership in combat in battle during Operation Desert Storm. He served as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the White House in 2020. He has a PhD in international relations and is a very loud and outspoken advocate for military reform. Today we get into this and much, much more. We tour the world dissecting various conflicts and getting to the incentives behind all of them, wrapping up with China's true strategy when it comes to Taiwan and what their real incentives and goals are. Spoiler alert, it is not what the media is telling you. You're going to want to stick around to the end for this one. It's a wild ride. I learned a ton. Here is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, welcome to the show, Colonel Macgregor. It's great to have you on today.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so in finance, one thing that we say is follow the smart money and you'll figure out what's about to happen next. I've heard you say recently that Washington is donor-occupied territory. Now, donors may or may not be smart money, but it's definitely big money. So it's got to be influential. My question for you off of that is, how much of a democracy can America be if the capital is controlled by donors?
Not much. I think that's the short answer. And I think this constant use of the word democracy is very misleading. I'm not even sure if people understand what it actually means. And you get a different answer depending upon whom you speak to. The problem with donor occupation is as follows. In the 1990s, and actually earlier in the 80s, Ralph Nader used to talk about Washington as corporate occupied territory. And his argument was you walk up and down the halls and everybody is on somebody's payroll. In other words, you're receiving lobbyist money to make decisions that are favorable to this or that corporation or industry. Now that still goes on, but today we have something that's a little different insofar as we have what I call oligarchs, billionaires. People with huge quantities of money who are in a position to dramatically shape policymaking. Right now, the focus in policymaking has been war in Ukraine, open borders, and war in the Middle East. Now, why would Americans have any interest in what happens in Ukraine? The United States has never had any strategic interest whatsoever in anything happening in Ukraine, let alone Eastern Ukraine. There's nothing there that we buy. There's no one there that we would sell anything to. So why are we suddenly interested in Ukraine? We need to ask that question. The answer is we're not. The American people have no interest in that whatsoever. Then why are we pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine and into a government that the CIA helped to install through a coup in 2014? Well, who's interested in Ukraine? Now you have Larry Fink, who's the CEO of Blackrock, who is currently discussed as the likely individual whose organization, Blackrock, will rebuild Ukraine whenever the war ends. Gosh, that's interesting. Have you ever heard of anything like that in the history of the United States, where we went to war somewhere and we knew that when it ended, we knew exactly who the corporate head was who was going to lead the rebuilding effort? And we had set aside $1 trillion for the purpose? I mean, stop and think about that. So who is Larry Fink? People need to look him up, figure out why is he interested in Ukraine? What is his relationship with Tony Blinken, with Biden, the Biden White House, the administration, any of the leading figures in the cabinet? Why would he want to do this at all? And is there not something else even more lucrative for BlackRock to invest in? So that, people need to follow the trail that leads to answers to those questions. And they'll begin to understand, why are we so committed at this stage to an offensive war that Israel wants to wage with virtually the entire region. Remember, this all began ostensibly on the basis of the 7 October attack. Well, the 7 October attack has been debunked in many respects, in that not all, but most of the horrific atrocities associated with decapitating babies or baking babies in ovens and mass rapes and murders and so forth. Many of those assertions have turned out to be false. We know that. Secondly, I was in Israel in 2020, and I actually visited the headquarters that sat right outside of Gaza, that was responsible for securing the area. I thought the security was airtight, and they had covered every conceivable base that you could. They knew who was doing something in Gaza almost before the individual inside Gaza knew he was doing it, to the point where someone in Gaza took a shot at an Israeli soldier in one of the guard towers that overlooked this giant sort of barbed wired, fenced in concentration camp. And they knew which person had actually fired the round. I mean, they had this thing nailed. Now, we also know that before this began, there was a group of Israeli women. These were women serving in the Israeli Defense Force who were given the responsibility to monitor everything that was happening inside Gaza. It was an intelligence cell. And you have to understand, the Israelis are very smart in the way they utilize human capital. When you come into the Israeli Defense Force, they put you through a battery of tests, and they determine where you can be most useful and helpful to the national defense. And then they assign you accordingly. So these women were picked up for their intelligence, their understanding, their command of languages, and so forth. And they reported that there were preparations obviously underway inside Gaza for a very long time, indicating that something really big was building. And they kept telling people and telling people and telling people, telling the chain of command, the people who were in charge. The answer was, well, thank you very much. We've got that covered. Nothing changed. Then you had the deputy chief of intelligence in Egypt, the Egyptian military, the day before the attack, who called to warn that this attack was imminent and described that it could be very dangerous. And he was thanked for his interest in Israel's national defense, and nothing was done. And then you have this long delay before Israeli forces actually show up on the scene, and then they start killing everybody. And when I say everybody, I'm also talking about, unfortunately, a number of Israeli citizens, along with whatever else they could find that was moving out of the country back into Gaza. The whole thing is very, very suspicious. And then suddenly, instead of this vengeance campaign designed to permanently disabuse Hamas of the wisdom of ever trying something like this again, it becomes a scorched earth policy of mass murder and expulsion. In other words, we're now going to wipe out Gaza. And after Gaza, we're going after the West Bank. And oh, by the way, we're going after Hezbollah. And then you have weeks later, Netanyahu saying, well, now's the time for us to settle accounts with everybody. And we discover that he has the United States Armed Forces effectively under control of Israeli national military power. And that the American people haven't been consulted on any of this. They're simply saying, oh, yeah, sure, we should support Israel and help Israel defend itself. Yeah, but this has very little to do with defending Israel. This has a lot to do with militarily establishing Jewish supremacy in the Middle East. Do we really want to sign on for a war that pits Israel against everyone in the region? Hundreds of millions of Muslims. How does this help us? That question never comes up. Instead, we deploy 3 carrier battle groups, hundreds of aircraft, dozens of ships, submarines, along with special operations forces and other elements of the Army and the Marine Corps. And then we wait and we wait and we wait until Netanyahu decides when and how he will attack Iran. And we hear that we are now part of this imminent attack on Iran. Now, this means a declared war? No, there's no declaration of war. There is no debate in Washington, no discussion. Gosh, isn't that a little odd? But then again, there was never any discussion or debate in Ukraine or about Ukraine or whether or not we should go there. All these things seem to flow very, very rapidly without much question. So why is this the case? Well, how much money is involved? Who's getting the money? Now, we already know that dozens and dozens and dozens of members of Congress show up and they may be worth 150 to 4 or 500,000, occasionally a million. And they all leave as multimillionaires. Where does all of this money come from? Who is bankrolling it? Who is pushing it? And that's what you've got to go back and look at, the not just the industries and the corporate groups, whether it's, an organization like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin that obviously profits enormously when large numbers of missiles and rockets and so forth are utilized. That's one piece of it. Who else? Who wants this? And what is this thing called the American Israeli Political Action Committee that has billions of dollars ostensibly at its beck and call? And that money is not coming from Israel. That comes from within the United States. That's why AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, as we call it, is not a foreign lobby. Its money originates inside the United States. Who is behind AIPAC? Who is contributing this money? And how does this money drive the United States into what looks like a regional war, beginning with a major attack on a foreign country without any debate, without any vote, without any discussion? The same thing happened with Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. Suddenly, overnight, Russia is transformed into evil incarnate that has to be destroyed. Again, no debate, no discussion. It's suddenly delivered as a fait accompli. Americans are asleep. They're not paying any attention. And one of the problems is that most Americans, most of the time, Jay, don't pay attention to what happens overseas. They're concerned with what happens here, which is appropriate. I agree with them. This is where we should be focused. There's nothing more important overseas than what's happening here in the United States. And I think perhaps more recently, the abysmal failure of FEMA to do anything effectively about the mess created by the last hurricane, leaving people stranded, hundreds of people dying, people contemplating suicide because they felt hopeless after the loss of their families and houses. And now and then being told, well, we don't have any money, we can't spend any money, but at the same time, we can send another 567 million to Taiwan. Again, have we had any discussion or debate about this? Or billions that are going over to Ukraine, or how many billions are going in every day in the Middle East? That all goes without question and no discussion. But we can't seem to spend effectively to support Americans who are in desperate condition. And now we have another hurricane coming through. What is going to happen now? It's not just America last. It's America's not even seriously considered. Why? We've got to go back to donor occupation. Who are the donors? Where's the money coming from? And how much money are we talking about that each congressman or a member of the Senate ultimately benefits from? And remember, there are various ways to benefit. Certainly, they'll put money into your reelection campaign fund, whether it's the defense industry or the Israel lobby or some other lobby. But there's also the benefit of aligning yourself with these lobbies. They can arrange for lucrative deals for you, especially after you leave office. If you retire from the military, they can give things to you, opportunities to you that you might otherwise never get. So it's a complex picture. And then, of course, the media. And you have to ask the question, well, who owns the media? Because the media now is no longer in the business of supplying news and information on a daily basis. I mean, if you turn to Fox or CBS or NBC, they'll tell you something that's happening somewhere, but they'll tell you their spin. You'll get their version. You're not necessarily getting the truth. I think somebody once said the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. I think the beginning of political wisdom is mistrust of government and the media. It's a desperate situation that we're in right now. We don't have control over anything. But I can guarantee you that Mr. Netanyahu has infinitely more control over what happens with U.S. armed forces and American foreign policy than you or I or any group of American citizens.
Okay. Thank you for that, Colonel. I want to try to pull on some threads and unpack that a little bit. And so when we walk through the war in Ukraine and why would America be supporting this, and maybe BlackRock's got a huge incentive from an infrastructure standpoint. I've also heard Senator Lindsey Graham come out and talk about the trillions of dollars of natural resources beneath the surface in Ukraine. I haven't seen.
Of course, that's 2.5 years into the war.
Right.
There was never any mention of that previously.
I never knew Ukraine. I mean, grain producer, definitely commodity rich, but I didn't know about the geology. I am a mining investor. However, it is what it is. Walk through, but there's financial incentive. Like migrate over to the Middle East. Maybe you can make a similar claim. There's the defense contractor revenue that can be made and natural resources. Maybe it's a similar dynamic. My question for you coming out of this would be, United States is in a lot of trouble financially, right? We are adding to the debt plus $2 trillion per year. I mean, when Trump took office, his promise was to clean up the debt, right? And balance the budget. He ended up being the most fiscally irresponsible president America had ever seen, until Biden took the seat, and then he blew his record out of the water. And I think Biden blew the 8-year record in 4 years. Both candidates, I think, will execute the exact same way after the election, whoever wins. Print to appease near-term masses. The United States can no longer afford their debt. I mean, we're getting to that situation of fiscal dominance. So we need a growth boom. We need some kind of an economic boom. And is this reaching into foreign conflicts at all costs? And, you mentioned that the public's asleep and they're not paying attention. But then you talked about the media. And I thought, yeah, the media, the public is paying attention. They aren't asleep. They think they're being virtuous, right? They think they're understanding the scenarios, but they're being fed the narratives that have been crafted. And, it drives me and likely you crazy, but also you can't fault the people to a huge degree if all they're being fed is garbage and they're just eating it, right? It is what it is.
Well, I agree with you to a point, but I think you can blame the people, because if you're serious about a republic, that means that you are voting people into power to represent you. Now, you have to pay attention to who that is. How many people really know who the people are that represent them? Do people actively involve themselves in the selection of these representatives in the primaries? Where do these people come from? The whole political process in this country is in trouble. If you want to run for the Senate, the average cost of a senatorial campaign now is about $20 million. And in most cases, if you want to be a senator, the expectation of the party structures, if you want to call them that, is that you will finance yourself. In other words, if you can't come in and ante up at least 10 of the 20 million on your own, people are reluctant to support you. Same thing is true at the congressional level. Now, there are places that are more expensive than others, but it's not unreasonable to expect a congressional campaign on average to cost a couple of $1 million. So once again, who ends up running? Well, in many cases, you do get people that already have a substantial chunk of cash under their belts. Mulvaney, who ran for office and then served briefly as chief of staff in the White House, I think he, as an attorney, had closed some lucrative deals and was worth a few $1 million and was able to finance his campaign. I think Andy Biggs from Arizona won the lottery, so he was able to largely finance his campaign. Otherwise, you have to prostitute yourself to someone. You have to sell your soul. If you look at someone like Pompeo, he was able to get elected because he effectively pledged undying allegiance to the Koch brothers. And if you're willing to become someone's puppet in terms of voting on the Hill, then you'll get their support. And you have to have people's support with a lot of money in order to make it into office. This means that your corruption, to some extent, is baked in, isn't it? How do you get there to begin with? There's a man named Buck who is leaving the Congress. He's from Colorado. He's out from Westminster, Colorado. That's where his district is. He wrote a book, The Swamp is Deeper Than You Think. I urge everybody to read it. He talks about what it's like to be elected to office and then the cold, hard facts. If you want to sit on a committee and have any influence while you're here over legislation, you have to pay us X amount of money, which goes to the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee. If you want to sit on a particular committee in the House, then you have to pay another amount of money in order to effectively buy your seat on that committee. This runs into hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he said, well, I don't have it. And the individual that was briefing them said, oh, yes, you do. Just look behind you. There's a building behind you. Well, that's the K Street lobbyists. In other words, all the big corporations, whether it's Monsanto or anybody else. I mean, we could just go down the list. Hey, there's money there. Go get it. And then you give us the money and you get to sit on the committee and you have a say in things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is this government? Is this democracy? It's kind of ridiculous if you stop and think about it. So I don't know what we call it anymore. But the notion that we have a republic that is remotely responsive to the actual needs of the American people is a bit silly.
Mm. Well, thank you for pushing back on that, because I do agree with you. It's not proper to let people off the hook entirely just for sucking up the media narratives. It's your fault if you believe that the FDA will take care of your food supply. It's your fault if you think the media is there to educate you.
That's right.
It's your fault if you think the politicians are so altruistic. They really have your best interest in mind. You have to take some accountability. Okay, 100%. I agree with you there. So I want to pick on the third item that you mentioned. You said, why are we at war in Ukraine? Why are we at war in the Middle East? Why do we have open borders? And I feel like I can wrap my mind around the incentive structure of wars. Agree with it or not, there's money to be made.
Yeah, but the average American isn't making any money.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree
as a result of going to war. So
100%.
How does he sold on this? Well, first of all, he or she may not even be interested. Remember that certainly for decades, war, we're talking about conflict in general, is something that happens on someone else's soil. And when's the last time somebody dropped a bomb on us? Well, 2001, one can argue, had the equivalent of that with the Twin Towers. But other than that, what have we had? Not much. And this is part of the problem. If you believe that conflict or war is something that someone else experiences and you're remote from it, you don't ask very hard questions. At the height of the British Empire, in 1879, Britain sent troops all over the world, a very small force, didn't need a lot of people. They did not make some of the mistakes that we did in Iraq and try to govern everything themselves. They usually utilized or organized indigenous people to do that. But there was a very famous event, which everybody's made movies about, called the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, where a British regiment of a little more than 1,100 was annihilated by Zulu warriors. And everyone was shocked. And in Great Britain, very few people had paid any attention to where any of their troops were, because the loss of a professional soldier in the British Army here or there just didn't get much attention. But suddenly, the loss of 1,100, everybody was enraged. How could this happen? Whose fault is this? This is gross incompetence and so forth. The government fell. Prime Minister Disraeli, very brilliant prime minister, by the way, he was shocked. He said, who are these Zulus? I've never heard of them. Okay, so this is sort of where we are in the United States. We're much like the British Empire. Nobody's paying any attention to what happens around the world, as long as we don't have a big butcher's bill, as long as you're not saying, oh, we just lost 400 men or 300 this or whatever. Remember when we lost the men in the Beirut bombing, the Marines who were killed in that barracks? I think it was 1982 or 83. 82. Yeah, it was a very interesting event. And I actually had the good fortune to sit with Cap Weinberger after he had left his job. And this would have been in 1997. And he wanted to talk to me about a book that I'd written called Breaking the Phalanx, which he liked very much. And we discussed that. But, once we had discussed that and he said, this is, I think what you've outlined should be implemented, and this makes a lot of sense. Then he started talking about other things, and he brought up the bombing. And he said that Ronald Reagan and he had gotten along, but that he was shocked when he learned that Ronald Reagan had committed American Marines to intervention in Lebanon at the time. Remember, you had the Israelis who were fighting it out with the PLO, and there were massacres and all sorts of terrible things happening. So we agreed we would go in. We defended the airport where nothing really happened and the Marines were prepared. They dug in, they did all the usual things Marines do as infantry. But you had this hospital, and that was a fairly administrative area. No one anticipated a problem. Even the guards didn't have ammunition with which to shoot. In comes this truck loaded with explosives, and boom, we kill 300 some people. You remember what happened. That got attention instantaneously all across the United States. And Reagan felt terribly about it. And we all know he went to the airport at Dover, Delaware, and as all these Marine remains were brought back in their coffins, he was there. And he essentially represented the nation in mourning over the loss of these men. Now, this is what Weinberger told me. He said he was sitting in his office, and then he decided to turn on the television. And on the television, they announced that we were sending Marines to Lebanon. And here's the Secretary of Defense who found out about it by watching the news. Well, he was very upset. So he called Reagan's secretary and he said, "Can I come over and see the president right away?" And she said, "Of course." So a few minutes later, he gets in the car, drives over there, goes to the White House, and he walks in to see President Reagan. He says, "Sir, what have you done?" He said, "What do you mean, Cap?" He said, "You just committed American Marines to this mission in Lebanon. This is a serious mistake." And President Reagan sort of sat back and said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, what happened?" And Reagan said, "Well, George Shultz, the Secretary of State, came in here, another member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the standard interventionist crew, and said, well, we have a moral obligation to intervene. We're going to go in there and save lives and stop this killing and blah, blah, blah." And Cap said he told President Reagan, he said, "Sir, that's not going to happen." He said, "We can't fix this. Putting our men at risk in this place isn't going to work." He said, "Okay, Cap, well, I said I'd do this. I made that decision. I should have consulted with you, but it's a done deal, so it has to happen." Now, from this point, we fast forward to the bombing. And as soon as that bombing happened, President Reagan told his secretary, "Get Cap Weinberger to come over here immediately." Weinberger came over to his office, and Cap said when he opened the door and walked in to see President Reagan, Reagan was standing there, not at his desk, standing there waiting for him, put his hands out, shook his hand. He said, "Cap, you were right. I was wrong. I should never have done this." And he said, "Well, sir, I appreciate that." He said, "Cap, we're going to get those Marines out of there right now." He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "We're getting the hell out of that place." Now, stop for a minute and remember that Reagan said, "We will find the perpetrators. We will chase them all over the world. They will never get away with it." What did he do? He got out, which was the right thing to do. Right. There was nothing for us to win. There was no victory opportunity. Well, you can take this example and stretch it out to include Iraq, Afghanistan, a whole number of places. We could have gone into Afghanistan, acted very decisively, very quickly, and dispatched bin Laden and his friends and left. In fact, CIA station chiefs who were there at the time, they would tell you we could have handed a bag of gold to the famous Mullah Muhammad, who would have turned them all over to us without hesitation because they weren't Afghans. Now, did we really have to go in and occupy Iraq in order to get Saddam Hussein and remove the top people? No, we did not. And when we did get him, we could have left. Anyone in the United States would have said, "Yay, that's great. Well done. Get the hell out." But what did we do? Well, we were going to build a new democracy. We were going to build a liberal democracy in Afghanistan. We were going to ensure that women didn't have to wear veils and all little girls could go to school and so forth and so on. Listen, everybody thinks little girls should go to school, but most of all here in the United States, not in Afghanistan. What they do is their business. But that wasn't what we told people. I think Americans are easily beguiled with arguments based on democracy and human rights and goodness. They want to believe that we're always the men in white hats that show up to rescue everyone from disaster. It's not that way. In fact, we've caused millions of people to lose their homes, to end up in sheer and terrible poverty in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. We've killed hundreds of thousands. Some people think we've killed over 1 million. The bottom line is, here we are again. What are we doing in Ukraine? What is this regime that Zelensky runs? Who is he? Where did he come from? He was a comedian, Russian-speaking comedian, out of nowhere, who's picked up by an oligarch. He ends up being installed, and we use him as our man to fight Russia. I mean, his Ukrainian was so bad at the beginning, he had to spend months learning how to speak it properly. What are we doing? And Ukraine is an organized crime state, much like Mexico. How many tens of thousands of women and children have been trafficked out of Ukraine under Zelensky? He shuts down Orthodox Christian churches. He prosecutes any opposition. He outlaws any alternative party or structure. Look, it's a disaster. But what do we hear? The Ukrainians are a brave people defending their democracy. Are you out of your mind? That's nonsense. 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead. That country may never recover. Millions have left it. It's a catastrophe. Fast forward to the Middle East. What are we doing now? Are we helping the Israelis to become more secure, or are we actually helping them to commit suicide? Because as I see it right now, they're on the path to fighting not only everybody in the region, including ultimately at some point the Turks, but then also the Russians. So what are we doing? And how does any of this serve our interest? How does this help us, let alone Israel? If Israel is on the path to suicide, that is not a good thing.
Okay, so where I want to go from here, where there's a handful of places I want to go from here, but I think, and just to correct myself, because I jumped in and said 1982, the Beirut bombing was in 1983, and as far as I understand, that was the founding event of Hezbollah. It was the sort of
Hezbollah was founded before that. Hezbollah is a creature of Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. When the Israeli Defense Force first invaded Lebanon, they were welcomed virtually as liberators, because the Shiite Arabs that lived in the south felt that they were being victimized by the Sunni Arabs in the north and Syria. And the Israeli invasion initially promised to sweep those other elements out of Lebanon. Unfortunately, like every other occupying power, they stayed too long and made bad decisions, and eventually offended and alienated the people that initially welcomed them. So you've got to understand that just as Hamas was a creation of the Mossad and Mr. Netanyahu, so too was Hezbollah, a creature of Israeli occupation. Disastrous. Need to understand that, because until you come to terms with this, you're not going to ask any other questions about how what the Israelis are doing now is going to help them long term.
Right.
And I don't see any evidence that it will.
Yeah. Okay. I want to add another player, shouldn't say a third player, another power player into this conversation, and ask you what, if any, influence China is having on either of these conflicts. And you could look at the Belt and Road initiatives through the Middle East and say there's a power balance that's occurring right there through proxy wars. You can say the same thing in Europe, of course, and then its own, our own tensions brewing in the South Pacific. But what, if any, influence and what role is China playing in these two conflicts right now, Colonel Macgregor?
Well, if you keep in mind that for the last 2,500 to 3,000 years of human history, China has arguably been the richest country in the world. They are again in that position. And everything they do is bound up with that wealth. The Chinese are not about military intervention. They're not about occupying other people's countries. They're not about waging war. They build what they build for national defense. And frankly, the Chinese military over the last several hundred years has a terrible reputation. They've been defeated by everybody. And out of the last 500 years, for approximately 350, they've been occupied and ruled by foreigners. In most cases, Mongolian, Turkic peoples, but then also Europeans and also the Japanese. The Koreans have fought. This is not not talking about South or North, just Korea. The Koreans have fought roughly 72 wars against the Chinese, won all of them but three. China is not known for its martial prowess, its military expertise and professionalism.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, but in that 3,000 year history, are there any examples of China overtly attacking a foreign nation?
Only when they were ruled by the Mongols. When the Mongolian dynasty took control, the Mongolian dynasty tried to extend its authority and power over Japan and over Vietnam and parts of Southeast Asia. And that also left the Vietnamese, as you can imagine, the people down there with a permanent distaste for Chinese in their mouths. And of course, the famous, divine wind, the kamikaze, as they call it. It came up and destroyed most of the Chinese fleet that was carrying the Mongolian army across to Japan so that the Japanese forces could annihilate whatever was left of them when they crawled upon the beaches to survive. So I think, no, the Chinese are really not interested. The Chinese have always viewed themselves as the center of the world. Seriously. And whether or not you were civilized or cultivated and should be treated as a civilized entity depended upon your distance from China. If you were close to China, you were only semi-barbarous. The further away from China you were, the more barbarous you were. The Chinese are an interesting people, and they have many attributes and many talents, but they're by no means inherently expansionist or aggressive. When they have expanded, it's because of their fecundity. In other words, their increase in population. And in fact, they tried to, quote unquote, Sinify the Mongolian peoples. They thought, well, perhaps the solution is to send women to Genghis Khan and his friends. So they sent over hundreds of women to them. And Genghis Khan famously ordered their execution because he told his chieftains, if you take Chinese women, they will breed Chinese children. The children will learn to be Chinese, and in a generation or two, there will be no more Mongols. And indeed, that's what has happened in some parts of China. If you go down to southwestern China from Shanghai across to where Vietnam is, that entire area was originally Vietnamese. But instead of being overtly conquered, although it was overrun under the Mongol dynasty, the real change came about with intermarriage. And the Chinese simply bred out the other population. And that's one of the things that the Japanese fear and the Koreans fear. There's great fear that the Manchus, who were also a Mongolian people, ruled China until the last dynasty fell in 1901, 1903, after the Boxer Rebellion. And they no longer exist. The last Manchu who could speak, read, and write Manchurian died about 20 years ago. There are no Manchus anymore. Manchuria is now Sinified. It's part of China. Now, people will, the dummies in the West don't understand this sort of thing, and they'll argue, they don't understand Asia. Asia is different from the West. Can't compare the two under any circumstances, but people in Asia are very sensitive to this. And they're not afraid militarily so much of the Chinese as they are of the other. So when you go into various Asian countries, you have a long history of periodic ethnic cleansing of Chinese. Just a few years ago, there was a dispute in the South China Sea between Vietnam and China. And the Chinese tried to set up a drilling platform for oil in what the Vietnamese said were their waters. There was an unholy collision over this. They almost went to war. But inside Vietnam, there were factories that the Chinese had actually come to Vietnam and constructed, built, and they were run by Chinese. Those factories were burned down. Many of the Chinese were killed, and ultimately Xi sent ships and aircraft to evacuate the Chinese from Vietnam. Now, why didn't they go to war? Because the people in that part of the world are pretty rational, and they understand that war rarely benefits either party. Now, today, the Vietnamese, despite their very strong objections to many Chinese policy positions, particularly those on the waters of South China Sea, where the Vietnamese have fortified or militarized as many or more little islets in the South China Sea as the Chinese have. Nevertheless, the Chinese and the Vietnamese have established a hotline. And if something truly dangerous occurs, their leadership immediately communicates. They all talk to each other because they want to avoid all-out war. That doesn't mean that they're going to solve all the differences between them, but it reflects a certain predisposition to understand that all-out war is destructive and self-defeating. I think we could learn a lot from them in that connection.
And how much of that is got to be because of how frequently and recently war has been on the doorstep, whereas America hasn't had war on the doorstep since the Civil War.
That's right. That's the last war that really resulted in mass deaths of American citizens and the destruction of American property.
Is this correct, Colonel Macgregor? During the American Civil War, very close to that same decade, there was a civil war fought in China during the Taiping Rebellion, and I think 600,000 people died in the American Civil War. Horrific body count. 20 to 30 million died in the Chinese Civil War. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around that number because of what.
Well, you also have to note that the reason for that civil war was there was a Chinese man who led the rebellion who declared himself to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ.
That's right.
And this, of course, frightened the dickens out of the Chinese. So the notion of introducing Christianity in that country is tantamount in their minds to injecting them with cancer. This is something else we don't understand. The British, when they first got control of India, spent a few decades trying to Christianize millions of Muslims and Hindus. This resulted in something called the Sepoy Rebellion, which was essentially a Hindu Muslim military rebellion within the British Indian Army against British rule. It consumed a lot of people. Lots of people were killed, and the rebellion left a permanent mark. But it also changed British policy. It was very clear to the British ruling India that trying to force Muslims and Hindus to become Christians was a catastrophe. It stopped. We need to understand these things about these nations, and how we behave towards them is very, very important. And of course, we could go on and on. There's a great one called Sands of Empire, a great book about the Middle East. It goes into some detail about all of this. And the author tries very hard. This came out early, I would say 2005, somewhere in there. The Sands of Empire, trying to explain the sort of imperial folly of becoming involved in the region. And even today, Israel is viewed as an extension of Western imperialism and power. The British set it up, and we've kept it going. That's the view from the Arab side. And right now, all the Israelis have done has reawakened those old demons. They're back in force now, and they've enraged the entire area, the entire region. Some people would say all of Islam.
So given what you just shared on the psychology of Chinese warfare, let's call it that, what do you make of the constant conversation at home here about the near-term potential Chinese hostile takeover of Taiwan? Because a variety of opinions. And I always wonder, are we using an American perspective to think through a Chinese problem, and that's why we just don't understand it? What you just shared would lead me to believe that the threat of a hostile takeover is almost non-existent. A recent guest of mine walked me through the history of that civil war and how, in legal terms in mainland China, the island of Taiwan is just the People's Republic of China. That's what it is. And this is a civil war stalemate. So there's a legal case, sort of like Hong Kong, almost like Hong Kong, how Hong Kong was co-opted back into China. What's your take, Colonel?
I think the Chinese took the position, and we tended to agree with them, which is why we went to the one China policy, that Taiwan and China and the Chinese mainland are both part of the same greater Chinese nation. And I think we accepted the proposition that at some point in the future, there would probably be a peaceful reintegration, much as what you've seen with Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony for 100 years, and then it was turned back to China. And that turn back was done without violence. And if you go back and look at the problems that we had in Hong Kong recently, if China were the evil fascist power that we claim, there would have been tens of thousands of dead in the streets of Hong Kong. There were none. The Chinese could have intervened, and Xi did not. I think that you have a similar phenomenon with Taiwan. Now, we have to understand that on Taiwan, there are two major parties. They're not the only parties, but the only ones worth mentioning. One is the old Kuomintang party of Chiang Kai-shek. That's the party that emerged when the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Chinese that fled the mainland came to Taiwan. Then there's another party, which, I can't pronounce it and I wouldn't do it very well. I'll just tell you that it's a liberal party that was always arguing for greater democracy, but also has privately aspired to sovereignty for Taiwan that is separate from the Chinese. Now, those two parties have struggled for power. Right now, the old Kuomintang controls the parliament. At the moment, the president, however, is from the other party. The Kuomintang that used to be violently anti-communist, it probably still is, has concluded that the Chinese on the mainland are not communists, and indeed they aren't. I know that you have great luminaries that really understand China brilliantly, like Pompeo and Tom Cotton and others, who like to talk about the Chinese Communist Party. Well, good luck finding a communist in China. Those people are the best capitalists the world has ever seen. No one's interested in communism in China, least of all the government. The government, however, is a one-party state. It is a fascist state, and it has a form of state capitalism, where the state and the private economy are inextricably intertwined. Now, over time, will that change? I have no idea. But the point I'm trying to make is that China is not the aggressive, expansionist, communist power anymore. And right now, I think what you've got on Taiwan is the majority of the population would like peaceful reunification at some point. And then a minority of the population talks about independence, understanding full well that that could lead to a war that really no one in Taiwan wants. Now, what is most important to understand about Taiwan in this century right now? What's most important to understand is that during the Second World War, Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Japanese armed forces. All the major interventions into China by the Japanese starting in 1937 were launched from Taiwan. Taiwan at that time was Formosa and a Japanese colony. Even today, the Japanese are seen very differently on Taiwan from the way they are seen in China. And the various heads of state of Taiwan have always been fluent in Japanese. And whenever they have visited Tokyo, they have spoken Japanese, even to the Japanese parliament. That's never gone down very well with the Chinese on the mainland. But why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing it up because it's important for us to understand that the only way you get a war that involves China with Taiwan, invading it, occupying it, or anything else, is if a foreign power, i.e. the United States or Japan, place forces on Taiwan with missiles that can reach the mainland. Then you get a war. The Chinese will put up with and ignore many insulting behaviors. And we engage in insults against them all the time when we sail our carrier battle groups through the straits when there's no real need to do so. Are the Chinese or the Russians sailing their carrier groups through the Caribbean? Are they holding exercises in the Gulf of Mexico? Of course not. They don't understand why we want to do those things. But again, I think that most of what we do in foreign policy has two purposes. One, somehow or another, it may or may not profit us. And we can go into the ways, as you pointed out earlier, that the wars, particularly in Ukraine, have made a lot of people rich. All you have to do is visit the 7 counties that surround Washington, D.C., that are the richest counties in the country, and look at the homes and who lives in them. And yes, war has been profitable for a minority of people. It has helped keep people on assembly lines in some states. There's no doubt about it, because we continue to produce a lot of military equipment that, frankly, we don't need. That's anachronistic, but that's another subject. But on the other hand, if it's not profit, then what else is it? Well, I think we do a lot of things because we want to preserve what we think is our political military hegemony over the world. That hegemony consists of the use of American military power and financial power against anyone we don't like. And right now, this has bred this organization called BRICS, which wants to build an alternative financial structure for the world. And we have 84 countries waiting in line to join BRICS, which already consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia. The Turks are going to join it. That's quite clear. I think we may actually see some members of the European Union join it. And then there's going to be a currency, some form of currency that's probably backed by a basket of commodities, primarily gold, but not exclusively. And this is going to facilitate business in a way that we have not seen, because we built the system we use after World War II designed to enrich us and to extend our power. Now, that system manifested by the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, and obviously the use of the dollar, whether it's a SWIFT system or anything else, that has annoyed people, because we have been in the business of telling countries what crops to grow. We have been in the business of telling with whom they could or could not trade. We have been in the business of trying to shape their economic development in ways that made us successful. I think that's over. This is 80 years since the end of the Second World War, and the world that we inherited in 1945, where we were largely untouched by the war, was a world that was in ruins. That world has recovered. And we're seeing many of the great states of the past, Iran, once called Persia, China, India, others, the Turks, who were once the Ottomans. All these countries are making a comeback in their respective regions. And we have treated this as a threat to us, a threat to our hegemony, which ends up positioning us in opposition to them. This has fed the growth of BRICS. And it's not just BRICS, because right beneath the surface, of course, is a growing set of arrangements, security arrangements, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, and informal agreements that pit us against those countries potentially in a war. This is not the time for us to wage war. The time for us right now, if anything, is to retrench, to rebuild, to come back home, to focus on our own manufacturing base, our own scientific industrial development, our educational systems, to build ourselves up. We have been living on the capital that we inherited from 200 years of hard work by people before us. We've used it up, we've wasted it, we've squandered it, and we are deeply in debt. This is the time to rebuild and reorient ourselves to our own hemisphere. Stop meddling in other people's affairs. But Washington doesn't want to do that. Washington loves to play the imperial power. And so you have a collision here coming between the American people, who on the one hand are really interested in what I just described, and the Washington, or what I call the ruling political class. You can call it the globalists, the neocons, whatever you want to call them, but the ruling political class. They want to continue. And why wouldn't they? Why would they want to disrupt the money flow? So that's why all these previous discussions, we're going to reform this or change that. Come on. It's never happened. It's not going to happen until you get a financial reverse, which I think is coming. I can't predict it with certainty. It's the black swan phenomenon. Only I do think that when you listen to someone like Rubini, who spoke today, what did Rubini say? Rubini said, we're in a lot of trouble, and it's very, very close. Armageddon is just over the horizon. Look at his remarks today. Look at what Nassim Taleb has had to say. These people have been looking at these phenomena for a long time. We're on the verge of it. And at the same time, we are courting or cultivating two major wars that could actually escalate to the nuclear level over places that we don't need to fight. First of all, we have no interest in Eastern Ukraine except peace and stability. And when you come to the Middle East, you don't have to park a tank on top of the oil well to get the oil out.
Okay, there's a few ideas I want to pull on here, and one I think it's very important because if I were to if I were to pick some high conviction opinions that most North Americans have, or even Westerners have, one of them might be that China is an oppressive dictatorship. That might be a common opinion held. And when you talked about the sort of retakeover of Hong Kong and it was relatively peaceful, my mind immediately went to the protests in the streets and the riots. But, you made sense of that and you said, no, because protests were allowed to happen, that's evidence that this is not a top-down oppressive dictatorship. That's sort of like the American rage scenario. We are allowed to protest in the street and get out of control. That's sort of what defines freedom to a certain degree. And
there's also a lot of evidence that organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy are really organizations of subversion that promote revolution and rebellion in the countries where we want to assert ourselves or where there are governments we don't like.
Right.
And the NED is actually in many ways a co-conspirator or perhaps even an arm of the CIA. That was very much in evidence in Hong Kong.
Okay.
It was evident in Kazakhstan in 2022 and 2023, where we tried to foment an uprising there, and the Russians were called for help, and the government put it down. If you go to places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, you're going to find governments there that will tell you point blank, I've got 500 Islamists in my jails. And I've already executed 500. Are you going to give me a hard time over that? Because if you are, get the hell out of my country. Because if I let the Islamists out, then they're going to create chaos. And I can't have that in my country. In other words, there is no sense of empathy for the critical need around the world, first and foremost, for some degree of order. If there's no order, how do you develop a society based on laws?
For sure.
How do you do anything?
Which kind of gets me to, you pointed to the BRICS, and that is our migration away from a unipolar world, kind of a reversion to the mean, which is multipolar power. And in a multipolar world, you could make a case that conflicts will be more consistent and regular because when there's one gangster ruling the town, everybody gets in line, right? But the world is anarchy, right? There is no law and order from an international standpoint. And so if you move from a unipolar to a multipolar world, you leave a lot of countries to question whether this is the opportunity for them to make their play and make their move. And do you think that's correct? And if so, is it a fair assumption to make that as we move towards multipolarity, that we see more regional skirmishes bubble up to the surface? What do you think?
There was a man named Hedley Bull who taught at Oxford, and he was a brilliant man who focused on international relations. He wrote a book called The Anarchical Society, and he talked about the nature of anarchy in the international system. And he forecasted a world in which you would have regions, and within these regions there would be dominant powers, but that the age of unipolarity was over. And this is long before the Soviet Union collapsed. He was looking beyond that. I think he was right. And I think, as I was trying to say before, in many of these regions, there are long established civilizations, countries that represent civilizations. They are roaring back into strength and health. Instead of trying to suppress them and beat them down, which is what we've been doing, my argument is this is the natural order of things, and we should let it alone. Secondly, there's a map, and I wish I had it at my disposal, that shows the frequency of wars and conflicts. So first over the last 300 years, then over the last 500, and it goes back to 1,000. You very quickly established that in most of Asia, most of the rest of the world beyond Europe, there were remarkably few conflicts. Most of the major conflicts were in Europe and the Mediterranean, and later on it spills into North America, arguably because Europeans take it over. That the rest of the world really was not that heavily engaged in warfare as many of us assume. It was more the exception than the rule. I'll see if I can find that and send it to you, Jay, because it's very illuminating. And I think to some extent, conflict is inevitable for us because I'm talking about Europeans, we struggle not just for dominance, but to assert ourselves, to develop, to build, to invent. It's a positive thing, but it has negative effects. You know, there's a famous story, I think Ray Bradbury wrote it. It's set in ancient China. And it's a discussion about a Chinese who invents an airplane. And this airplane is really a glider, but the emperor is brought out to watch this glider take off, fly around the Forbidden City, and then land in the square. And after it's over, the emperor congratulates the man. Everyone is enormously impressed. And when the emperor returns to his palace, he says, bring that man to the palace and execute him. And people are shocked. Well, this man's brilliant. He invented this airplane. He said, exactly. That's why I'm executing him. Now, China is very much that way. There's an old saying in China, if you're 6 feet tall and everyone else is 5'8", your head's going to be lopped off. Now, we think this is awful. I do. It's not something that I favor. But their view is that you have to have stability and order. And if stability and order are destroyed or disrupted, you end up in chaos. Now, China is probably one of the places in the world where there are more people engaged in cheating the government and each other than anywhere else on the planet. So Xi spends most of his time looking at corruption and people involved in corruption and arresting generals in the People's Liberation Army and Navy. They arrested someone in charge of the shipyards who was building ships with faulty hulls because they used substandard materials. Naval architects cheated. I mean, I could go on and on. There was just within the last year, there was an inspection of coastal missile batteries. They discovered that the fuel in the missiles had been taken out and sold on the black market. The missiles wouldn't have worked because there was no fuel. What's going on? That would never happen in Korea. That would never happen in Japan because the Koreans and the Japanese are both very, very patriotic people. They would never put their country at risk, but the Chinese would. It's a strange society. On the one hand, it exalts intelligence. It likes meritocracy, but it also tends to equate the amassing of wealth with virtue. And of course, that's very dangerous because if you think wealth equals virtue and intelligence, you're in for an inevitable disappointment. Wealth is more evidence for greed than it is of anything else. But the Chinese don't see it that way. That's why President Trump, when he was announced, was so popular in China. They said, obviously, he's a great man. Look at all the money he has.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you reminded me of a lot of the sort of Opium War era stories that I'd read and how prolific corruption was and why the uncorruptible Commissioner Lin was placed in charge of the opium trade because he was, a needle in a haystack in terms of his integrity and what a rarity that was.
Well, Jay, it's also back to your point on the Taipei Rebellion.
Right.
What are the Chinese interested in? No more Taipei rebellions.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't thought about it that way when you framed it like this is their experience with Christianity. 20 to 30 million people dead in a civil war. I mean, that directly caused and related. And you're right. It was, and I'm failing on his name, but he had a dream where he and his bearded brother were ridding the country of demons. And then he stumbled upon a Bible, read it, and said, clearly the bearded brother was Jesus. And so I am therefore God's Chinese son. And that was the story of the Taiping. It's a horrible story, but it's a fascinating one. And anyway, so I want to get back to the arc of American empire. Maybe we'll kind of bookend our conversation around here. We've seen five major empires in the last 600 years in the West, right? Christian empires. The Portuguese and Spanish were more maritime and regional, but the Dutch was a legitimate international empire. The British solidified that. Because prior to that, the Celestial Empire of China, as you mentioned, was still the wealthiest and most innovative in the world. But if you look at the cadence with which we pass that puck, from the Portuguese to the Spanish to the Dutch to the British to the Americans today, it gives you a hint at the expeditious nature with which power does rotate and how quickly these empires rise and fall. My question for you is, if the American empire were a baseball game, Colonel, what inning are we in, and what does the future look like? Because it's really easy to paint a super bleak, doom and gloom, empires fall scenario, but it doesn't always pan out that way. I mean, London's still a great place to visit. So is Madrid. So is Amsterdam. How do you analyze that fall of empire conversation?
What do those empires really have in common? The Portuguese, lesser extent the Spaniards, but still the Spaniards as well, and ultimately the Dutch and the British and us. We're all maritime powers. In other words, we are not necessarily inherently land powers. Wars in Europe,
like regional land
the
powers,
Germans
right,
and the Russians, the Austrians, the French, were really about land, territory, population, and trying to acquire it and dominate it and hold it against all comers. The maritime powers looked away. They looked across the seas, and they found places where they could easily dominate. They could create terms of trade that were in their favor because the locals were behind them, let us say, in terms of either technology or the understanding of commerce. If you look at the British Empire was always interested in making its colonies dependent upon it. The colonies would produce raw materials. In other words, India produced linen and cloth. The British then would make the clothes and then sell it back to the people in India. The British were interested in doing that to us during the Revolutionary period. Washington and the others, they were British. They understood exactly what was happening, and they said, we don't wish to be a backwater. We don't want to be deindustrialized and turned into some sort of, subjugated appendage. We are going to be great. They really thought that, and that's what they set out to do. They won that revolution, and what was their focus? The expansion of the United States to the Pacific. You can read it with Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, doesn't matter. Everybody is marching west to the Pacific. Now, my point is this. We are, in our mentality, maritime powers. And beyond maritime, we now think in terms of aerospace. But we really aren't land powers. We don't maintain very large armies because we already have an empire. It's called North America. It's us. It's only been in the 20th century that we were then subsequently enticed into going into other people's wars and conflicts, which we had at least until World War I largely avoided. And then you get into this debate about, well, we have a moral obligation, but there are also people that stand to profit from it. How did we make money during the First World War? Well, when the French and the British were mired in defense, fighting against the Germans, they ran out of money very quickly. And when they ran out of money and they ran out of resources, where did they turn? They turned to us. Now, if we had really been interested in ending the First World War, we would have denied them credit. We would have denied them resources to say, no, we think this is a very stupid war and you should stop fighting it, in which case the French and the British would have been out of business very quickly. But we didn't do that. We kept it going. Well, who got rich during the First World War? The people that made munitions, the people that made clothing, the people that grew food, the people that drilled for and found oil. We just go through the whole gamut. They made enormous quantities of money, and we, in turn, expanded and dramatically improved our scientific industrial base as a result. And when World War II comes along, FDR and many of his advisors said, perhaps we can do the same thing to get out of the Depression. If the British and the French go to war with the Germans, they'll be back where they were before. Another trench line. It'll drag on. Then they'll need us. We can provide them with the money and the materials the way we did the last time. Didn't work out that way. The Germans overran everything in a few weeks. Mm-hmm. But that's where the mentality was. In other words, we were never really interested in building a large overseas empire and garrisoning it. That's a consequence of the Second World War and the Cold War. We had to remain in places like Korea and Germany. We had to remain in Japan. We had to remain in the Mediterranean. We ended up with forces in places where we had never been before. But then it became a self-justifying exercise. And it was also mortgaged to vanity. We have an army in Germany. We have an army in Korea. We have the Pacific Fleet. We have the Atlantic Fleet. We have fleets everywhere. And this sort of thing played well at home. Americans were cheered. Oh, we're great. We're the greatest power ever. Yeah, and we've also bankrupted ourselves in the process. We have, 840 bases all over the world. How many bases outside beyond the borders of China did the Chinese have? Last time I looked, it was 2.
Right.
And the same thing is true for the Russians, assuming there are 2. I think there's at least 1, that's Syria. That's just because they worry about the Straits of the Bosphorus being shut down, and then they want access to the Mediterranean. In other words, who are we kidding? But this territorial empire is a loser. In 1947, after World War II, the British Empire was financially destroyed. And their debt to GDP ratio in 1947 was 240%. When it reached that level, they said, this is it. We can't do this anymore. And they abandoned India overnight. And India was the jewel in the crown. It was the cash cow. They extracted 40 trillion from their empire, much of it from India, over the preceding hundreds of years. But suddenly it was a burden, not an asset. We haven't figured it out, but it's a burden, not an asset for us to have troops and naval forces everywhere. And then finally, technology has changed, which means that everything is under permanent or what we call persistent surveillance from outer space, from thousands of satellites. And if you lose the satellites, you've got thousands of unmanned systems, aerostats and aircraft that can do it. You have sensors on the seabed, on the continental shelves. You have submarines and submersibles. In other words, the idea that you're going to surprise someone the way, say, the Germans surprised us in December 1944 is gone. You can't do that anymore. Everything is going to be under surveillance. It's going to be seen. And if you put a lot of forces forward, which we do right now, they are in closer proximity to the potential opponent, which makes it easier for him to destroy them with his missiles. I think when Mr. Netanyahu unleashes his attack on Iran, which will involve a lot of missiles, but it'll be largely aircraft or aircraft-launched missiles, a few from ships at sea and Israeli submarines, but most of it will be aircraft launching and delivering weapons. Iran will launch missiles, period. They don't have much of an air force, although now they do have thousands of Russians on the ground in Iran, and they do have a large number of Russian pilots who are prepared to get into aircraft and fly them. So they have that. But even then, the Air Force will be used, much as it has been in Ukraine, to augment and improve upon the air and missile defense, as opposed to the way we are accustomed to using it in a purely offensive way to strike and destroy the enemy. And we'll see these two paradigms in opposition. What I'm trying to tell you is that the paradigm of the future is the missile paradigm, not the aircraft delivered weapon.
And I have to just, I know I've kept you longer than promised already. I promise I will get there soon. However, I'm not done. So there's going to be a part 2 to this. Let me know in the comments if you want the Colonel back for a part 2. I know you do, but look, this brings me back to where we started, because what you just said, we have sensors in the seafloor, we have satellite imagery everywhere, better than ever. It's no longer possible to surprise people. Well, the public was surprised twice in the last 2 years with invasions. I think, even as Russian troops lined the border with Ukraine, the media was scoffing at the idea that Putin would actually invade until we woke up the next day to headlines of an invasion. Nobody was talking about Hamas invading Israel until we woke up in the morning to headlines of an invasion. So those two things can't coexist together unless we were just to say that these were scripted the entire time, or there's some deeper motives that were long standing. Correct?
We spent several years in the late 30s trying to goad the Japanese into attacking us. It became very, very serious from 39, 40, and 41 because we had not recovered from the Depression. And the only way to escape from the Depression was a war. All of FDR's policies had fundamentally failed. Morgenthau, his Secretary of the Treasury, testified before Congress in 39 and said flat out, we don't know what to do. Everything we've tried has failed. Now, why war? Well, the Japanese, yes, they were expansionist. Yes, they went into China and so forth. And what they did in China was reprehensible. But the Chinese were ultimately willing to do business as long as they could receive the resources from us that they needed. Resources, tin, steel, iron, coal, oil. And what did we do? In July of 1941, we embargoed Japan. And it was obvious then to General Marshall in the Army and Admiral King in the Navy that this meant war with Japan. They had a meeting right away. It was convened. You can read the minutes. They said, with the decision to embargo Japan, war with Japan is now inevitable. The question is, how do we defend ourselves? And we were worried about the Philippines because we knew the Philippines were largely indefensible. Why? Well, we're 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 miles away. It's on Japan's doorstep. Just as it's impossible to defeat Russia and Ukraine because Ukraine is on Russia's doorstep. Pretty stupid.
Yeah.
If you think you're going to defeat Iran by fighting on Iran's doorstep, I think you're in for a surprise, particularly since they enjoy the support of Russia and China. So my point is this. We knew that a lot of things were going to happen, and privately we wanted them to. There were a lot of people who were very happy when the Russians finally intervened because we've been pushing the Russians to do exactly that for years. And we thought this was our great opportunity to harm and destroy Russia. That hasn't worked out very well. But we certainly have harmed ourselves and destroyed NATO.
It's a silly and I probably shouldn't off-color comparison I probably shouldn't make, but I grew up playing hockey and my role on the team was the instigator, and it's a very valuable role to trigger the other team, continue to poke, chip away until you get a reaction disproportionate. And then you gain control of the situation, right? That's the strategy on the ice. I'm familiar with the technique. Look, Colonel, this has been phenomenal having you on the show. I'm really glad you could make the time. Thank you very much. I'd love to have you back. Love to have you back for a part 2 because, as I said, I could keep going here. We could move from continent to continent and keep this going. Lots more I'd love to talk to you about. In the meantime, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.